Thank you very much for having invited me. And since I'm not able to speak Italian language, we meet on neutral ground. I'm speaking English, which is a foreign language for me and for most of you, I think. And we have to deal with Hegel, a German philosopher, in this language. If it happens that I have to try to make clear something and cannot do it without doing it in German language, there are some here who will be able to translate it in Italian language. I hope I can avoid that. Professor Menegoni and I agreed that I shouldn't talk more than 40 minutes, and I will try to do that. For preparation, you got 4 papers of mine in advance to read. These are the English versions of my work on Hegel, and so it means it's only a small part of it. And for those of you who can read German text, I also have brought with me this volume of my papers, and I will say during my introduction in which of the German versions, in which chapter you find more of what I have to say here, because what I want to do now is to give a very sketchy overview of what is my conception of Hegel's conception of the mental. And their problems begin because, as you may know, it is a problem to translate Hegel's notion Geist into the English language. And you either choose mind and the mental, or you choose spirit. And the problem is that in Hegel's theory of Geist, aspects of both of these concepts are included. And since you cannot translate the Phänomenologie des Geistes in mind or spirit or both, so you have to make a decision here. In the following, I will use mind and mental, not spirit, for reasons which might become clear later, mainly because I want to give my overview by comparing some of what Hegel is telling us about the mental to contemporary analytical philosophy of mind. One could do this otherwise. One could illustrate the main features of Hegel's theory of Geist by comparing it to Aristotle, which this is something he explicitly does himself, or by comparing it to Kant. This is what 95% of German Hegel scholars would prefer to do. 80% of the book Kant, 20% Hegel. This is the normal way we do it in Germany. I don't do that. Never. And you can compare it to Fichte, because there is a lot of deep influence and similarities in Fichte's theory of self-consciousness, for example, and in Hegel's concept of mental processes or events. And you can even do that, and if I would be in Japan, I had to say why I don't do that. You can do it by comparing it to Heidegger, for example. But since Hegel is a very complicated thinker and mind is a very complicated topic, I don't want to make it more difficult by choosing Heidegger or Aristotle or something like that. And since I have to talk in English, it is an easy choice to say I compare it to the contemporary analytical philosophy of mind. Not because I am of the opinion that this is the best theory of the mental we have. I specifically don't think that, because the best in that tradition is the late Wittgenstein, who is a German philosopher, or a German language philosopher from Austria. On the one hand, and I think Hegel and Fichte are by far the most interesting authors we do have on the mental, for reasons I will explain. But I can illustrate a lot of what I think is attractive in what Hegel has told us about the mental by comparing and contrasting it to contemporary approaches. And this is what I have tried in some of the papers you've seen and in other work too. So this is my agenda. First, I will remind you of the overall metaphysical structure in Hegel's system. I don't explain that. I will come back to this structure at the very end, and it's one of my open questions, or what I would say unfriendly and fierce questions. Yes. Then the second part, I will hint at what I think are the most interesting features of Hegel's concept or conception of the mental or the mind by relating it to what is in his metaphysical conception of idea qua concept of Geist qua self-consciousness. Okay? I will make this more explicit later. So to start with, you know the overall structure of Hegel's system. I'm dealing here with Hegel's system. This means starting from the big logic, 1812. And I completely ignore what has been done by him before. And I take the logic, the philosophy of Right, or Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, and the Encyclopedia as the main texts. I completely ignore what's toward the lectures, what has been edited as Hegel texts which are not from Hegel himself. As we now know, they are written by scholars and so on. In this structure of the Encyclopedia, we have three parts. We have the logic, we have nature, we have mind. And within mind we have three layers: subjective, objective, and absolute. Yeah. This is what you can see in the table of content. Underneath this, there is a self-realization of something very mysterious. Hegel calls the idea, single one. It's not an idea in the Humean sense or an idea someone has when he invents something. It's a basic entity organizing and realizing itself through these stages in a self-fulfilling structure which includes concepts and reality and representations of reality. This is what he means by the absolute. There is nothing outside it. The absolute is not, in my reading, the word for God, but God is one metaphor for being absolute. It's the opposite way around. And this is one of my premises. I'm one of those guys who think that the best overall interpretation of the metaphysical structure in Hegel is the left Hegelian interpretation. No transcendence. But we can discuss that also. I have to say it here because in some places it is relevant for the way I tell the story. Now, another thing is that in my own systematic approach to questions concerning the mental, but not only the mental, I think it's a very good idea to start from the notion of action. Taking action, the basic phenomenon, as a complex phenomenon from which you can nearly organize everything in philosophy. And I think in some sense Hegel has done that also. He has done that in that moment when you allow yourself to understand what is the logical process in terms of actions. If you don't allow that, tell me a story what it is. So that's one of the left Hegelian movements. The idea is nothing but the organized overall structure of all human practices and life forms, nothing else. Not more, no less. Okay, this is a hard start to begin with, but this is why I say the way I deal with it is a kind of pragmatist reading of it, and then you know why I agree with or why I think that the late Wittgenstein or William James would be another good philosophers to combine with Hegel. And as has been mentioned in the introduction, Marx was the one who said that at the heart of the Hegelian thinking is the notion of labor. And labor is one version of action. So I think Marx was the first to establish that Hegel was a pragmatist. So there's another of these nice big theses we can discuss later. To begin with, I hope some of you are familiar with contemporary analytical philosophy of mind, a little bit. I think you said that your students are interested in Hegel's concept of mind. Okay. So, non-guilty. Let's go to this. I tell you 4 features which I think are essential features of Hegel's conception of the mental or the mind. I will not be very careful here now to distinguish between the mental mind or mental episodes and so on. Everything I would have to do if I start in a careful analysis. If you have the basic structure here, just to remind you, if this is the metaphysical overall structure, you don't have an ontology of things and properties or functions, but you have an ontology of one self-related process. It's a process ontology. If you really take this seriously, it's a logical process. Yeah? In the author you can read to see how difficult this might become as Whitehead, for example. And the question is, how can you have such a rationalistic metaphysics by having a process ontology? This is one of the very interesting features of this, or strange features. So, if I really say the mind, don't think there is a thing having properties or something like that. My working definition, just to say it, is the mental is, according to Hegel, well, if I'm careful, I would say, according to my conception of what Hegel's conception of the mental was. Yeah, I ignored that problem, and I simply take the stance that I tell the truth. So I say that is Hegel's conception of the mental, and Hegel's conception of the mental is it's rule-following interaction of a subject with an object. This object can be part of the world, nature. It can be another subject, or it can be the whole life form of itself as such. And I think this quite nicely mirrors this structure. The idea is as the subject always in relation to itself on different levels or aspects, qua world as nature, qua itself as subject in all over the mind, and then in its immediate internal subjectivity, in its social dimension, and in its cultural self-interpretation dimension. This is, I read, absolute spirit, not as transcendence, but as the grammar of our social languages of self-expressing and self-interpreting what we are as cultural beings. Yeah, it's a kind of hermeneutical point. And in objective spirit, you know, this is all what the social world is about. And in subjective spirit, you have all these phenomena starting from anthropology to psychology and so on. All these things are ways of self-realization by self-relating. The idea is self-related towards itself in logic, in nature, in mind, in a very complicated way. And the complexity of this structure as such is described in the logic. So it's a kind of mirroring of what's going on in one part as such, in the outer part as structure of the world, and as a way to come to a self-understanding in the dependent structures. This is what's going on in the overall system. And it's a process, and it's a kind of acting, because it's self-realization. It's nothing what we can say, it happens to the idea that it does it, but it's telos. So the main feature here is what I would say, it's teleological, it's essentialist, meaning it includes epistemic and ontological aspects at once. And if you say that, it's clear that the old distinction between anti-realism or realism is not what Hegel accepts as a starting point. there are, as you may know when you read the logic, parts of it in which you presuppose a dualism between knowledge and what is known. But this is only a local grammar for special purposes, not the overall structure. Right? And in different parts of the logic, he analyzes different presuppositions concerning the question how thought or the mental relates to the world as such. And he puts them into a philosophically organized structure which for him is to justify them. In philosophy, according to Hegel, we justify things by putting them in the right place in this structure, nothing else. It's not an external justification. It's all a kind of internal justification, and in the end, the idea justifies herself or itself or hisself by realizing adequately itself and understand that as what's going on. This is the overall structure. No external standard, another meaning of absolute. And Hegel always said, if there is an external standard to something which is named absolute, it cannot be the absolute because there is an external standard. That's not part of it. Okay, now to the mental. If we have this overall structure, and we say that the mental is dealt with in the third part, the first presupposition now is, in the logic we are not dealing with the mental. That's the problem. What's the logic about if not something we call the mental? Depends on your notion what the mental is, whether you say propositional structures are mental or not. If you say no, you maybe think the mental is psychological. If you say that, you have a problem with the social and so on, right? If you say no, it can be kind of meanings, what's the difference between what's going on in the objective spirit to the logic? You get a lot of interpretation problems, for sure. But I don't want to make things more complicated here than necessary. But if we have in the background this conception of idea, first thing, it should be very, very clear that you won't find any analytical contemporary philosopher of mind sharing this picture in the background. Meaning, if you have similarities on the surface, you will have very big differences in the metaphysical background of the story. And the question is what you are looking for. The wonderful fancy identities between Brandom or McDowell or Putnam and Hegel, or Rorty and Hegel, or the strangeness of this fellow from the 19th century having this complex metaphysics in the background. It's a question of interest. You can downplay this or you can emphasize it. If you downplay it, you can say, in a broadly Hegelian sense, Hegel has said what we now know is true because Putnam has said it in his last book. This is one way to do it. Or, in the real Hegelian sense, no analytical philosopher can tell us anything about Hegel because this is different. This is a very conservative idea. I never accepted both of these sides, but to do that in a different way is a complicated story. Now the features, just to put on your paper. The idea structure means that mind or mental is evaluative. You can say, if you want, normative, to have random within the picture too. I normally use the notion evaluative as the more general notion, having the axiological structure of the good and the normative of the right, both. And if you read Brandom, you only have normativity. And if you come from a more Aristotelian side or from the young Marx, you have more of the axiological side of the good life, of the fulfilling life, and so on. Yeah? We put it together. One thing is, the idea is a structure which has an essence, which is realizing itself. It has an internal normativity. Okay? And this means the conception of the mental in Hegel cannot be naturalized. Although some in the analytical camp, like Ruth Millikan, thought that what Hegel means by idea can be somewhat translated into what means evolution. Evolution is a blind causal process. Hegel's self-realization conception of the idea is not. So that is a cheap relationship. with Millikan. It is less cheap and less clear if you read the late John Dewey, who is an evolutionary thinker having understood Hegel and is always oscillating between naturalized ethics and ethical notion of nature. Muddle, very deep water. But one thing is, the heart of the mental is the evaluative and the normative. Second point, we have process and activity. We don't have substance and property in this picture. It's not that there is a brain having a feature or an ego having properties, but it's activity, spontaneity, self-relationship, there, and so on, interaction with the world. You have it in ecological thinking in contemporary analytical philosophy as a similar idea. And you have it, for example, in Dewey also. That if you want to understand what the mental is, show how an organism interacts with its environment. This is a deep Hegelian insight. But it's not naturalistic. That's always very important. And another point here to be mentioned, this structure is an hyper-rationalism. And this means everything which exists has a propositional structure and can be grasped by notions in principle. This is anti-empiricist. Yeah? Everything is propositional. And the main contemporary thinker having done that is the early Wittgenstein in this Tractatus world. But that world is a static world. No changes. And the interesting thing in Hegel is that he wants to have something like that using a process ontology. This is an alternative, very complicated, and I don't know whether you can make it consistent or not, but this is what he's trying to do. And this means the mental as such is fully to be made explicit in conceptual structures. And this is necessary for him because the telos of the mental is the autonomous self-consciousness fully transparent towards itself. And this means there cannot be anything which is not part of the mental and accessible to the mental. Right? If there would be something otherness in it. This is what the late Schelling said, and what Marx and Feuerbach tried to establish, calling it materialism. It was a crazy mistake to do it that way, but they did. So we have its evaluative or normative, its process, activity, and its hyper-rationalism. And if you have a cheap version of it, you have Brandon's interferentialism. It's activity by giving arguments, it's all about propositions, and it's a process. And it's normative. And you have making it explicit. And this is why there's a deep affinity, at least to some things. And what we are still waiting for since 1999 is Brandon's book to tell us how what he's doing compares to what the idea is in here. Yeah? I have an email, and it was from 91 or 92 probably. I sent him an email and said that another German colleague of mine, Clemens Stekeler-Weithofer, just told me that you are writing a book on this topic, and I'm deeply interested in it because I'm struggling with that problem. I got an email by Brandon from 1992, I still have it in my account, said it will take a few more months to have the book. And we're still waiting for that. It's a conference in Berlin in the summer where he will present some of the chapters. It will be very exciting. Now the point specific to the mind is the conception in Hegel is holistic. And holistic means you cannot understand the mental embodied in a human organism as an ensemble of special faculties or something like that. If you start to analyze one aspect, you have to unfold everything what is part of the mental. And this means not like Fodor having modules which are isolated, and not like Kant, this psychology of faculties. Hegel, as Aristotle, I think, is a holistic thinker in the mental. He's one in the overall metaphysical sense, but he is also one concerning the mental. This means that something like raw feelings or qualia, mental episodes not related to the conceptual structure, are not a part of what Hegel is thinking about. Everything what is part of the mental has a propositional conceptual structure, no raw feelings. But there is phenomenological consciousness. It means the phenomenological must be one version of having rational content. The idea of non-conceptual content is not open to Hegel, but it's very deeply discussed in contemporary philosophy of mind. Right? Okay, and the next point here, that the German word ich, or English I, is at the heart of the thinking of German idealism, starting from Kant on, put Schelling later than 1804 into brackets here, nearly everybody knows, right? And there is a lot going on here if you have this as a central element in philosophy of mind, or even in the overall metaphysical structure. I discuss it only under the label of what the mental is, and here you have the first relevant thing. Kant said, ich denke, the transcendental apperception. And that's the same thought. If something is identified as a mental episode, it is presupposed that there is, as a dispositional structure within it, this grammatical feature. That it can be analyzed as I represent that structure. So representationalism is something in Kant also. This is, I think, the same idea. And this here means we have the mental on the personal level, because it's always an episode presented, or at least dispositionally related to a self-conscious being. And it means spontaneity, a topic you famously find in Fichte's concept of Tathandlung. Yeah? Against the empiricist tradition, the mental is not the passive getting something from the world, but the active producing and doing something with the world. And even sometimes doing something out of its own sources, being spontaneously. And Hegel belongs to this activist camp in the philosophy tradition. There are some problems if you do it that way. Next thing is, because self-consciousness is understood as the basic structure of rationality, it is the kernel of what Wittgenstein had analyzed as rule following. Being a mental episode means having a content which is understandable as being rule following. This means normative. Yeah. And you cannot follow a rule alone, so the mental has to be social all the way down. No private, non-conceptual episodes. And the next thing in Hegel, it is not only rule following, but it is also realizing something inner by bringing it into the outer. This is an element apart from this Humboldt-Herder tradition. Charles Taylor has made it explicit, I think. It's expressivist. And it's not only spontaneity, but this is a movement we see in Fichte. Tathandlung is not only spontaneity, but it's also giving yourself the rules you are following and understanding yourself as a rule giver. This is the notion of autonomy. So it means a fully spelled out theory of what the mental is delivers a full spelled out theory of what autonomy is. And now you know that a lot of what's going on in analytical philosophy of mind is not in that business at all, right? Okay, so just to sum up, since Hegel develops his theory of the mental as the third part of this metaphysical structure, some of the main features what the mental is are determined. They are consequences of starting that way. And this is why he says that he is different to Aristotle, because Aristotle here has a kind of idea of nous and a dualistic approach, and not a kind of self-realization through all the stages. Aristotle has this layer picture in some sense. But Hegel was very clear that between Aristotle and him, no thinker ever had tried to give such a story of what the mental is. And so we have, it's evaluative, not a naturalistic theory, because even nature itself is philosophically spelled out, not a naturalistic phenomenon, but a teleological existentialist one. It's a meaningful one. And it's all the way down processes of self-organization, and nothing is in it which is not content, to use that. It's not meaning. It's holistic. You cannot analyze parts of it in isolation. And because the self-organizing principle in it, the individual instance of the idea within reality is individual self-consciousness. Yeah? Being at the heart of personal identity, being the center of spontaneity or freedom, being rule-following as conceptual, as concept users. Concepts are nothing else but rules. A concept is nothing but a tool to subsume individual tokens under one general concept. And this is the basic version of rule following. And it's expressivist, and it tells this self-determination and self-realization by it, and this is the idea of autonomy. These are the main features. Okay? And if we do it this way, we don't only have the problem that a lot of analytical philosophers would say, I don't understand a word, but there are really tough questions now. And I'll address 4 of them, and the 5th is an open, general question. Maybe I should say, I gave you some of the papers, per accident those in English, related to this story. What is in this here is in this recognition paper. And what's in this activity thing and the evaluative thing is in the agents theory things. And something I will have to say now concerning the problems is in this paper addressing the phenomenology of spirit. Because now we have some problems with this. The first question is, what about subpersonal aspects of our mental life? Is Hegel in principle able to develop such a notion as the unconscious? If yes, in which sense of the unconscious? If I say his conception is personal, it directly means that defining mental states beneath the level of what the self-conscious structure is a conceptual mistake. If this is true, either cognitive science is a discipline which is not philosophy at all, and we have to tell a story how the philosophy of the mental relates to other disciplines doing research. This Hegel discusses in the chapter I've dealt with in the paper on the reason apprehended irrational. Hegel has to say, and Hegel in this encyclopedia discusses empirical research on mental phenomena, especially those not fully realizing the structure. Schlafwandel, hypnose, for example. The insane, he's discussing mental illnesses. Okay? He's discussing phenomena, part of the real world, which are not expressing the correct structure. His main philosophical argument simply is we are in the part of the subjective or objective spirit, and this means conceptual structures are sometimes not perfectly realized. This is everything we can say about that from a philosophical point of view, not more. This is something like the normative full approach, and if you have some phenomena which are not fully realizing it, this is all we can say about it. They are deficits. Okay? Not more to say about. But Hegel was fascinated by the literatures giving these studies to understand how this is related to these problems. And the methodological thing is, we have a pretty good understanding what the normal functioning mental life is. And from that as our starting point, we can understand what mental illnesses are, not the other way around. This is a very methodologically interesting point. And the point here simply is, if people start, like cognitive science, to define quasi-mental episodes meant to be operative beyond what is at the level of the personal, it's a philosophical problem, and it's not clear whether we can really make sense of it philosophically. But a lot of contemporary philosophy of mind is doing that, and Wittgenstein had criticized that in the 50s, and Hegel had criticized it 150 years ago, and he discussed brain sciences, for example, in this interesting thing, and he says, well, you can do that, but what you find there can be very helpful for your empirical interests, but is not illuminating from a philosophical point of view. Why not? What's the only interesting philosophical point of view? Which contribution does the phenomenon make into this story? And brain science cannot make a chapter in this story, because this is philosophy. But Hegel said, well, not every question is a question of philosophy, and other sciences can do what they want to do, as long as they don't use their concepts to do philosophy. Now, the problem is not that brain sciences are doing different things. The problem is if you use the concepts used in brain science to make bad philosophy of it. And now you can think about how many analytical philosophy of mind is ill from this mistake, because they think if it's used in empirical science, this is what really is going on. And if they use these concepts for their purposes, we have to use them as the starting point for our metaphysical ontological thinking. And Hegel would say, and he's doing that in the Phenomenology of Spirit, no way, it's the other way around. They have to use concepts which are fitting to our overall logical structures. And we can say for which purposes limited concepts are used and are useful, and not the other way around. This is what he always criticizes. If people use limited concepts, he calls them Verstand normally, try to do something which is on the level of Vernunft, they are making mistakes. They are making bad metaphysics. Okay, one question is, how can I deal with subpersonal mental episodes, or whatever you want to term them? Other way around, what is cognitive science talking about? If it's understood as philosophy, as naturalized philosophy of mind. Another question here, do we have a theory as philosophers how our way of doing philosophy of mind is related to other disciplines dealing with the mental? Psychology, as we do it now, is dealing with the mental in some sense, but it's not philosophy. So the question is, how generally, what is the relation between Hegel's philosophy towards other disciplines who are doing research? And I think he's mainly discussing that in the Phenomenology of Spirit. Okay, next big question. If it is a personal, what is with animal mentality? There's one big problem if you end in the philosophy of nature in the system. Hegel ends with complicated organisms living in social relationships, not with humans. When he starts in subjective spirit, he only discusses human individuals having self-consciousness. And now you always can ask, do have animal, non-human animals spontaneity and are part of this? We would get a problem in terms of morality and so on quickly, because they would be too smart to be eaten or something like that. Or, other way around, if this full-blown structure is needed to have mental episodes at all, have we to be Cartesians to say that animals don't have mental episodes? Or do we need a second theory for non-human mentality, non-spontaneous structures? And can that be part of philosophy or not? Or is this to be studied by biology, cognitive science, or so on? It's a very interesting question. If our self-understanding, and we are here in making explicit our way of being in the world, is deeply structured by our being these kinds of rule-following, self-conscious beings, actors, what are we doing when we tell a story about a rat or a tree or something like that? It's a very interesting question, and what would Hegel's answer be? I don't know exactly. He bypasses that by simply going from the second part of the system to the third without telling anything about it. And he is bypassing it in another way by discussing mental illnesses and other things in footnotes, not in the main text. There is something in the main text sometimes, and it's not very clear what he wants to say, whether he would say it's diminished and it, for 80%, not for 100%, or to say it's not there at all. What would be a fool in Hegel's concept of the mental? It's a very hard question. I don't know any paper discussing that clearly. That is a hard question, I think. And maybe one wants to say the overall structure cannot be right if we are not allowed to say that mental insane have mental episodes, or dolphins have, or something like that. It's a problem. It really is a hard problem. And another thing, and this is what I have been trying to understand better in some of the papers and in the action theory book you mentioned, because there is an Italian edition. For sure, mental episodes somehow are not only evaluative and normative, but also causally relevant. You do something because you believe that something is, and you want something. And this because cannot be spelled out without relating it to causality. And now the question is how causality, teleology, and normativity fit together in Hegel's overall approach. The parts in the science of logic where he tries to give a general answer are one of the most difficult to understand. And another part where he gives us very interesting and illuminating hints is in his theory of action in the elements of right, where he says moral luck, for example. Yeah? You intend to do something, something went wrong. Are you guilty now and responsible now or not? And as I read him, causality is not a notion which is part of nature, but it's an element of action. The notion of causality is not part of the natural sciences, but it's part of an action theory. In nature we have regularities, but not causalities. But this is a very hard debate in philosophy of science. And one more point, classic, what is the relation of the mental to the physical? Right? Hegel's answer is quite easy, wrong question. Therapeutic stance. This is paragraph 398 from the Encyclopedia, 3rd edition. Yeah. And he's making the same move Davidson made in his famous paper, Mental Events in the 70s of the last century. But for sure, we have the deep impression there is something like the physical or nature, not only spiritual. Hegel is not a Berkeleyer. Even Berkeley wasn't one, I think. But probably the problem is that we don't get rid of the classical dualistic way of framing these questions. That's the problem. And like McDowell and others, and Wittgenstein, maybe the only good answer to the so-called body-mind problem is to say, don't worry and don't ask it this way. But most people don't think that this is a good answer, but only an answer of a kind of running away. So this is an interesting question. And another feature is, in terms of externalism, this I should mention. In philosophy of mind, in the contemporary, and I think the story for me is 1970 to 2010 or so, For some years, people thought the mental is somehow an activity in the brain, right? And then people saw, wow, I have some of the information on my tablet. And now the tablet is part of my mental because most of what I know is there. And they have the extended mind in the Chalmers sense. Yeah? First mistake to put into the brain and then to put it on the tablet. The mental has never been in the brain. This is wrong. If you have this theory, you are a social externalist, like Robert Pippin has told us long ago. What you really think and what you really do is not independent of the interpretation of others. It's being part of a social community. This is social externalism. And if you are a hyper-rationalist, it's the wrong idea to say that in a true thought, you represent what the world is. There is no representational content. You directly think the world. And some are discussing that as an identity theory of truth. McDowell is on the trip. And it's very difficult to spell it out. But McDowell is a metaphysical externalist. Brandon is a social externalist. Hegel has both externalisms. And they can have because of this overall structure. This is part of the modernity. And now you can ask, is a metaphysical externalist a realist or an anti-realist? I would say wrong question, because if you ask whether someone is a realist or an anti-realist, you presuppose a theory of how the mental relates to the world, which presupposes some aspects Hegel has criticized. So he would say therapy, like Wittgenstein in his latest writings on psychology. Most what is in contemporary analytical philosophy of mind needs therapy. This is what Brandon says. But the problem is to understand that this really means to stop asking these questions is a lesson very hard to learn. But I think we can learn it from Hegel and we can learn it from Wittgenstein. Sometimes we can learn it from William James too. And the really open question for me is, if we can say all these fun, fancy, smart, nice things on the mental by relying on this structure, how should we deal with this basic structure in Hegel's metaphysical thinking? Right? This is hard stuff for our times. And the question is this pre-Kantian metaphysics? Or can we give a reading towards it which makes sense without losing this, what we want to serve? And sometimes I think, I don't say any names because some are good friends of mine, but sometimes people ignore this, trying to get that on a cheap way. And I will say, if you don't have this in mind, you don't even understand what you have there. But if you see it this way, then the question is how to deal with that, give an interpretation of this. And my suggestion is, replace this idea with the human beings in social practices as active and interactive in the world as the basic structure. And retell the story as a pragmatist approach. And I think the young Marx was the one doing it. They're having the notion of species, being and labor as a part of it. And having the rest of this structure, that would be a lecture for the next time. Thank you.